Chapter 25. Enter Prince Charming. "I'm contrasting the claims of indoors and out," said Anne, looking from the window of Patty's Place to the distant pines of the park. "I've an afternoon to spend in sweet doing nothing, Aunt Jimsie. Shall I spend it here, where there is a cozy fire, a plateful of delicious russets, 3 purring and harmonious cats, and 2 impeccable china dogs with green noses? Or shall I go to the park, where there is the lure of gray woods and of gray water lapping on the harbor rocks?" "If I was as young as you, I'd decide in favor of the park," said Aunt Jamesina, tickling Joseph's yellow ear with a knitting needle. "I thought that you claimed to be as young as any of us, Aunty," teased Anne. "Yes, in my soul, but I'll admit my legs aren't as young as yours. You go and get some fresh air, Anne. You look pale lately." "I think I'll go to the park," said Anne restlessly. "I don't feel like tame domestic joys today. I want to feel alone and free and wild. The park will be empty, for everyone will be at the football match." "Why didn't you go to it?" "Nobody axed me, sir," she said. "At least, nobody but that horrid little Dan Ranger. I wouldn't go anywhere with him, but rather than hurt his poor little tender feelings I said I wasn't going to the game at all. I don't mind. I'm not in the mood for football today somehow." "You go and get some fresh air," repeated Aunt Jamesina. "But take your umbrella, for I believe it's going to rain. I've rheumatism in my leg." "Only old people should have rheumatism, Aunty." "Anybody is liable to rheumatism in her legs, Anne. It's only old people who should have rheumatism in their souls, though. Thank goodness I never have. When you get rheumatism in your soul you might as well go and pick out your coffin." It was November, the month of crimson sunsets, parting birds, deep, sad hymns of the sea, passionate wind songs in the pines. Anne roamed through the pineland alleys in the park, and, as she said, let that great sweeping wind blow the fogs out of her soul. Anne was not wont to be troubled with soul fog, but somehow, since her return to Redmond for this 3rd year, life had not mirrored her spirit back to her with its old, perfect, sparkling clearness. Outwardly, existence at Patty's Place was the same pleasant round of work and study and recreation that it had always been. On Friday evenings the big, fire-lighted living room was crowded by callers and echoed to endless jest and laughter, while Aunt Jamesina smiled beamingly on them all. The Jonas of Phil's letter came often, running up from St. Columbia on the early train and departing on the late. He was a general favorite at Patty's Place, though Aunt Jamesina shook her head and opined that divinity students were not what they used to be. "He's very nice, my dear," she told Phil, "but ministers ought to be graver and more dignified." "Can't a man laugh and be a Christian still?" demanded Phil. "Oh, men, yes. But I was speaking of ministers, my dear," said Aunt Jamesina rebukingly. "And you shouldn't flirt so with Mr. Blake. You really shouldn't." "I'm not flirting with him," protested Phil. Nobody believed her, except Anne. The others thought she was amusing herself as usual, and told her roundly that she was behaving very badly. "Mr. Blake isn't of the Alec and Alonzo type, Phil," said Stella severely. "He takes things seriously. You may break his heart." "Do you really think I could?" asked Phil. "I'd love to think so." "Philippa Gordon! I never thought you were utterly unfeeling. The idea of you saying you'd love to break a man's heart!" "I didn't say so, honey. Quote me correctly. I said I'd like to think I could break it. I would like to know I had the power to do it." "I don't understand you, Phil. You're leading that man on deliberately, and you know you don't mean anything by it." "I mean to make him ask him to marry me if I can," said Phil calmly. "I give you up," said Stella hopelessly. Gilbert came occasionally on Friday evenings. He seemed always in good spirits and held his own in the jests and repartee that flew about. He neither sought nor avoided Anne. When circumstances brought them in contact he talked to her pleasantly and courteously, as to any newly made acquaintance. The old camaraderie was gone entirely. Anne felt it keenly, but she told herself she was very glad and thankful that Gilbert had got so completely over his disappointment in regard to her. She had really been afraid that April evening in the orchard that she had hurt him terribly, and that the wound would be long in healing. Now she saw that she need not have worried. Men have died and the worms have eaten them, but not for love. Gilbert evidently was in no danger of immediate dissolution. He was enjoying life, and he was full of ambition and zest. For him there was to be no wasting in despair because a woman was fair and cold. Anne, as she listened to the ceaseless badinage that went on between him and Phil, wondered if she had only imagined that look in his eyes when she had told him she could never care for him. There were not lacking those who would gladly have stepped into Gilbert's vacant place, but Anne snubbed them without fear and without reproach. If the real Prince Charming was never to come, she would have none of a substitute. So she sternly told herself that gray day in the windy park. Suddenly the rain of Aunt Jamesina's prophecy came with a swish and a rush. Anne put up her umbrella and hurried down the slope. As she turned out on the harbor road, a savage gust of wind tore along it. Instantly her umbrella turned wrong side out. Anne clutched at it in despair. And then there came a voice close to her. "Pardon me. May I offer you the shelter of my umbrella?" Anne looked up. Tall and handsome and distinguished looking. Dark, melancholy, inscrutable eyes. Melting, musical, sympathetic voice. Yes, the very hero of her dreams stood before her in the flesh. He could not have more closely resembled her ideal if he had been made to order. "Thank you," she said confusedly. "We'd better hurry over to that little pavilion on the point," suggested the unknown. "We can wait there until the shower is over. It is not likely to rain so heavily very long." The words were commonplace, but oh, the tone! And the smile which accompanied them! Anne felt her heart beating strangely. Together they scurried to the pavilion and sat breathlessly down under its friendly roof. Anne laughingly held up her false umbrella. "It is when my umbrella turns inside out that I am convinced of the total depravity of inanimate things," she said gaily. The raindrops sparkled on her shining hair. Its loosened rings curled around her neck and forehead. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes big and starry. Her companion looked down at her admiringly. She felt herself blushing under his gaze. Who could he be? Why, there was a bit of the Redmond white and scarlet pinned to his coat lapel. Yet she had thought she knew, by sight at least, all the Redmond students except the freshmen. And this courtly youth surely was no freshman. "We are schoolmates, I see," he said, smiling at Anne's colors. "That ought to be sufficient introduction. My name is Royal Gardner, and you are the Miss Shirley who read the Tennyson paper at the Philomathic the other evening, aren't you?" "Yes, but I cannot place you at all," said Anne frankly. "Please, where do you belong?" "I feel as if I didn't belong anywhere yet. I put in my freshman and sophomore years at Redmond 2 years ago. I've been in Europe ever since. Now I've come back to finish my arts course." "This is my junior year, too," said Anne. "So we are classmates as well as college mates. I am reconciled to the loss of the years that the locust has eaten," said her companion, with a world of meaning in those wonderful eyes of his. The rain came steadily down for the best part of an hour, but the time seemed really very short. When the clouds parted and a burst of pale November sunshine fell athwart the harbor and the pines, Anne and her companion walked home together. By the time they had reached the gate of Patty's Place, he had asked permission to call, and had received it. Anne went in with cheeks of flame and her heart beating to her fingertips. Rusty, who climbed into her lap and tried to kiss her, found a very absent welcome. Anne, with her soul full of romantic thrills, had no attention to spare just then for a crop-eared pussycat. That evening a parcel was left at Patty's Place for Miss Shirley. It was a box containing a dozen magnificent roses. Phil pounced impertinently on the card that fell from it, read the name and the poetical quotation written on the back. "Royal Gardner!" she exclaimed. "Why, Anne, I didn't know you were acquainted with Roy Gardner." "I met him in the park this afternoon in the rain," explained Anne hurriedly. "My umbrella turned inside out and he came to my rescue with his." "Oh." Phil peered curiously at Anne. "And is that exceedingly commonplace incident any reason why he should send us long-stemmed roses by the dozen, with a very sentimental rhyme? Or why we should blush divinest rosy red when we look at his card? Anne, thy face betrayeth thee." "Don't talk nonsense, Phil. Do you know Mr. Gardner?" "I've met his 2 sisters, and I know of him. So does everybody worthwhile in Kingsport. The Gardners are among the richest, bluest of blue noses. Roy is adorably handsome and clever. 2 years ago his mother's health failed and he had to leave college and go abroad with her. His father is dead. He must have been greatly disappointed to have to give up his class, but they say he was perfectly sweet about it." "Fee, fi, fo, fum, Anne. I smell romance." "Almost do I envy you, but not quite. After all, Roy Gardner isn't Jonas." "You goose," said Anne loftily. But she lay long awake that night, nor did she wish for sleep. Her waking fancies were more alluring than any vision of dreamland. Had the real prince come at last? Recalling those glorious dark eyes which had gazed so deeply into her own, Anne was very strongly inclined to think he had. Chapter 26. Enter Christine. The girls at Patty's Place were dressing for the reception which the juniors were giving for the seniors in February. Anne surveyed herself in the mirror of the blue room with girlish satisfaction. She had a particularly pretty gown on. Originally it had been only a simple little slip of cream silk with a chiffon overdress, but Phil had insisted on taking it home with her in the Christmas holidays and embroidering tiny rosebuds all over the chiffon. Phil's fingers were deft, and the result was a dress which was the envy of every Redmond girl. Even Ally Boone, whose frocks came from Paris, was wont to look with longing eyes on that rosebud concoction as Anne trailed up the main staircase at Redmond in it. Anne was trying the effect of a white orchid in her hair. Roy Gardner had sent her white orchids for the reception, and she knew no other Redmond girl would have them that night, when Phil came in with admiring gaze. "Anne, this is certainly your night for looking handsome. 9 nights out of 10 I can easily outshine you. The 10th you blossom out suddenly into something that eclipses me altogether. How do you manage it?" "It's the dress, dear. Fine feathers." "'Tisn't. The last evening you flamed out into beauty you wore your old blue flannel shirtwaist that Mrs. Lynde made you. If Roy hadn't already lost head and heart about you, he certainly would tonight. But I don't like orchids on you, Anne. No, it isn't jealousy. Orchids don't seem to belong to you. They're too exotic, too tropical, too insolent. Don't put them in your hair, anyway." "Well, I won't. I admit I'm not fond of orchids myself. I don't think they're related to me. Roy doesn't often send them. He knows I like flowers I can live with. Orchids are only things you can visit with. Jonas sent me some dear pink rosebuds for the evening, but he isn't coming himself. He said he had to lead a prayer meeting in the slums. I don't believe he wanted to come. Anne, I'm horribly afraid Jonas doesn't really care anything about me, and I'm trying to decide whether I'll pine away and die or go on and get my B.A. and be sensible and useful." "You couldn't possibly be sensible and useful, Phil, so you'd better pine away and die," said Anne cruelly. "Heartless Anne." "Silly Phil. You know quite well that Jonas loves you." "But he won't tell me so, and I can't make him. He looks it, I'll admit. But speak to me only with thine eyes isn't a really reliable reason for embroidering doilies and hemstitching tablecloths. I don't want to begin such work until I'm really engaged. It would be tempting fate. Mr. Blake is afraid to ask you to marry him, Phil. He is poor and can't offer you a home such as you've always had. You know that is the only reason he hasn't spoken long ago." "I suppose so," agreed Phil dolefully. "Well," brightening up, "if he won't ask me to marry him, I'll ask him, that's all. So it's bound to come right. I won't worry. By the way, Gilbert Blythe is going about constantly with Christine Stuart. Did you know?" Anne was trying to fasten a little gold chain about her throat. She suddenly found the clasp difficult to manage. What was the matter with it? Or with her fingers? "No," she said carelessly. "Who is Christine Stuart?" "Ronald Stuart's sister. She's in Kingsport this winter studying music. I haven't seen her, but they say she's very pretty, and that Gilbert is quite crazy over her. How angry I was when you refused Gilbert, Anne. But Roy Gardner was foreordained for you. I can see that now. You were right after all." Anne did not blush, as she usually did when the girls assumed that her eventual marriage to Roy Gardner was a settled thing. All at once she felt rather dull. Phil's chatter seemed trivial, and the reception a bore. She boxed poor Rusty's ears. "Get off that cushion instantly, you cat, you! Why don't you stay down where you belong?" Anne picked up her orchids and went downstairs, where Aunt Jamesina was presiding over a row of coats hung before the fire to warm. Roy Gardner was waiting for Anne and teasing the Sarah cat while he waited. The Sarah cat did not approve of him. She always turned her back on him. But everybody else at Patty's Place liked him very much. Aunt Jamesina, carried away by his unfailing and deferential courtesy and the pleading tones of his delightful voice, declared he was the nicest young man she ever knew, and that Anne was a very fortunate girl. Such remarks made Anne restive. Anne's wooing had certainly been as romantic as girlish heart could desire, but she wished Aunt Jamesina and the girls would not take things so for granted. When Roy murmured a poetical compliment as he helped her on with her coat, she did not blush and thrill as usual, and he found her rather silent in their brief walk to Redmond. He thought she looked a little pale when she came out of the co-ed's dressing room, but as they entered the reception room her color and sparkles suddenly returned to her. She turned to Roy with her gayest expression. He smiled back at her with what Phil called his deep black velvety smile. Yet she really did not see Roy at all. She was acutely conscious that Gilbert was standing under the palms just across the room, talking to a girl who must be Christine Stuart. She was very handsome, in the stately style destined to become rather massive in middle life. A tall girl with large, dark blue eyes, ivory outlines, and a gloss of darkness on her smooth hair. "She looks just as I've always wanted to look," thought Anne miserably. Rose-leaf complexion, starry violet eyes, raven hair. Yes, she has them all. It's a wonder her name isn't Cordelia Fitzgerald into the bargain. But I don't believe her figure is as good as mine, and her nose certainly isn't. Anne felt a little comforted by this conclusion. Chapter 27. Mutual Confidences. March came in that winter like the meekest and mildest of lambs, bringing days that were crisp and golden and tingling, each followed by a frosty pink twilight which gradually lost itself in an elfland of moonshine. Over the girls at Patty's Place was falling the shadow of April examinations. They were studying hard. Even Phil had settled down to text and notebooks with a doggedness not to be expected of her. "I'm going to take the Johnson Scholarship in Mathematics," she announced calmly. "I could take the one in Greek easily, but I'd rather take the mathematical one because I want to prove to Jonas that I'm really enormously clever." "Jonas likes you better for your big brown eyes and your crooked smile than for all the brains you carry under your curls," said Anne. "When I was a girl it wasn't considered ladylike to know anything about mathematics," said Aunt Jamesina. "But times have changed. I don't know that it's all for the better. Can you cook, Phil?" "No, I never cooked anything in my life except a gingerbread, and it was a failure. Flat in the middle and hilly round the edges. You know the kind. But, Auntie, when I begin in good earnest to learn to cook, don't you think the brains that enable me to win a mathematical scholarship will also enable me to learn cooking just as well?" "Maybe," said Aunt Jamesina cautiously. "I am not decrying the higher education of women. My daughter is an M.A. She can cook, too, but I taught her to cook before I let a college professor teach her mathematics." In mid-March came a letter from Miss Patty Spofford saying that she and Miss Maria had decided to remain abroad for another year. "So you may have Patty's Place next winter, too," she wrote. "Maria and I are going to run over Egypt. I want to see the Sphinx once before I die." "Fancy those two dames running over Egypt. I wonder if they'll look up at the Sphinx and knit," laughed Priscilla. "I'm so glad we can keep Patty's Place for another year," said Stella. "I was afraid they'd come back, and then our jolly little nest here would be broken up, and we poor callow nestlings thrown out on the cruel world of boarding houses again." "I'm off for a tramp in the park," announced Phil, tossing her book aside. "I think when I'm 80 I'll be glad I went for a walk in the park tonight." "What do you mean?" asked Anne. "Come with me and I'll tell you, honey." They captured in their ramble all the mysteries and magics of a March evening. Very still and mild it was, wrapped in a great, white, brooding silence, a silence which was yet threaded through with many little silvery sounds which you could hear if you hearkened as much with your soul as with your ears. The girls wandered down a long pineland aisle that seemed to lead right out into the heart of a deep red, overflowing winter sunset. "I'd go home and write a poem this blessed minute if only I knew how," declared Phil, pausing in an open space where a rosy light was staining the green tips of the pines. "It's all so wonderful here, this great white stillness and those dark trees that always seem to be thinking." "The woods were God's first temples," quoted Anne softly. "One can't help feeling reverent and adoring in such a place. I always feel so near him when I walk among the pines." "Anne, I'm the happiest girl in the world," confessed Phil suddenly. "So Mr. Blake has asked you to marry him at last?" said Anne calmly. "Yes, and I sneezed 3 times while he was asking me. Wasn't that horrid? But I said yes almost before he finished. I was so afraid he might change his mind and stop. I'm besottedly happy. I couldn't really believe before that Jonas would ever care for frivolous me." "Phil, you're not really frivolous," said Anne gravely. "Way down underneath that frivolous exterior of yours you've got a dear, loyal, womanly little soul. Why do you hide it so?" "I can't help it, Queen Anne. You are right, I'm not frivolous at heart. But there's a sort of frivolous skin over my soul and I can't take it off. As Mrs. Poyser says, I'd have to be hatched over again and hatched different before I could change it. But Jonas knows the real me and loves me, frivolity and all, and I love him. I never was so surprised in my life as I was when I found out I loved him. I'd never thought it possible to fall in love with an ugly man. Fancy me coming down to one solitary beau, and one named Jonas! But I mean to call him Joe. That's such a nice, crisp little name. I couldn't nickname Alonzo." "What about Alec and Alonzo?" "Oh, I told them at Christmas that I never could marry either of them. It seems so funny now to remember that I ever thought it possible that I might. They felt so badly I just cried over both of them. Howled. But I knew there was only one man in the world I could ever marry. I had made up my own mind for once, and it was real easy, too. It's very delightful to feel so sure, and to know it's your own sureness and not somebody else's." "Do you suppose you'll be able to keep it up?" "Making up my mind, you mean? I don't know. But Joe has given me a splendid rule. He says when I'm perplexed just to do what I would wish I had done when I shall be 80. Anyhow, Joe can make up his mind quickly enough, and it would be uncomfortable to have too much mind in the same house." "What will your father and mother say?" "Father won't say much. He thinks everything I do right. But Mother will talk. Oh, her tongue will be as burny as her nose. But in the end it will be all right." "You'll have to give up a good many things you've always had when you marry Mr. Blake, Phil." But I'll have him. I won't miss the other things. We're to be married a year from next June. Joe graduates from St. Columbia this spring, you know. Then he's going to take a little mission church down on Patterson Street in the slums. Fancy me in the slums! But I'd go there or to Greenland's icy mountains with him." "And this is the girl who would never marry a man who wasn't rich," commented Anne to a young pine tree. "Oh, don't cast up the follies of my youth to me. I shall be poor as gaily as I've been rich. You'll see. I'm going to learn how to cook and make over dresses. I've learned how to market since I've lived at Patty's Place, and once I taught a Sunday school class for a whole summer. Aunt Jamesina says I'll ruin Joe's career if I marry him, but I won't. I know I haven't much sense or sobriety, but I've got what is ever so much better, the knack of making people like me. There's a man in Bolingbroke who lisps and always testifies in prayer meeting. He says, 'If you can't sign like an electric star, sign like a candlestick.' I'll be Joe's little candlestick." "Phil, you're incorrigible. Well, I love you so much that I can't make nice, light, congratulatory little speeches. But I'm heart glad of your happiness." "I know. Those big gray eyes of yours are brimming over with real friendship, Anne. Some day I'll look the same way at you. You're going to marry Roy, aren't you, Anne? My dear Philippa, did you ever hear of the famous Betty Baxter who refused a man before he'd axed her? I am not going to emulate that celebrated lady by either refusing or accepting anyone before he axes me." "All Redmond knows that Roy is crazy about you," said Phil candidly. "And you do love him, don't you, Anne?" I suppose so," said Anne reluctantly. She felt that she ought to be blushing while making such a confession, but she was not. On the other hand, she always blushed hotly when anyone said anything about Gilbert Blythe or Christine Stuart in her hearing. Gilbert Blythe and Christine Stuart were nothing to her, absolutely nothing, but Anne had given up trying to analyze the reason of her blushes. As for Roy, of course she was in love with him, madly so. How could she help it? Was he not her ideal? Who could resist those glorious dark eyes and that pleading voice? Were not half the Redmond girls wildly envious? And what a charming sonnet he had sent her, with a box of violets, on her birthday. Anne knew every word of it by heart. It was very good stuff of its kind, too. Not exactly up to the level of Keats or Shakespeare, even Anne was not so deeply in love as to think that, but it was very tolerable magazine verse, and it was addressed to her, not to Laura or Beatrice or the Maid of Athens, but to her, Anne Shirley. To be told in rhythmical cadences that her eyes were stars of the morning, that her cheek had the flush it stole from the sunrise, that her lips were redder than the roses of paradise, was thrillingly romantic. Gilbert would never have dreamed of writing a sonnet to her eyebrows. But then Gilbert could see a joke. She had once told Roy a funny story, and he had not seen the point of it. She recalled the chummy laugh she and Gilbert had had together over it, and wondered uneasily if life with a man who had no sense of humor might not be somewhat uninteresting in the long run. But who could expect a melancholy, inscrutable hero to see the humorous side of things? It would be flatly unreasonable. Chapter 28. A June Evening. "I wonder what it would be like to live in a world where it was always June," said Anne, as she came through the spice and bloom of the twilit orchard to the front doorsteps, where Marilla and Mrs. Rachel were sitting, talking over Mrs. Sampson Coates's funeral, which they had attended that day. Dora sat between them, diligently studying her lessons, but Davy was sitting tailor fashion in the grass, looking as gloomy and depressed as his single dimple would let him. "You'd get tired of it," said Marilla with a sigh. "I dare say, but just now I feel that it would take me a long time to get tired of it, if it were all as charming as today. Everything loves June. Davy boy, why this melancholy November face in blossom time?" "I'm just sick and tired of living," said the youthful pessimist. "At 10 years? Dear me, how sad." "I'm not making fun," said Davy with dignity. "I'm discouraged," bringing out the big word with a valiant effort. "Why and wherefore?" asked Anne, sitting down beside him. "'Cause the new teacher that come when Mr. Holmes got sick gave me 10 sums to do for Monday. It'll take me all day tomorrow to do them. It isn't fair to have to work Saturdays. Milty Boulter said he wouldn't do them, but Marilla says I've got to. I don't like Miss Carson a bit." "Don't talk like that about your teacher, Davy Keith," said Mrs. Rachel severely. "Miss Carson is a very fine girl. There is no nonsense about her." "That doesn't sound very attractive," laughed Anne. "I like people to have a little nonsense about them. But I'm inclined to have a better opinion of Miss Carson than you have. I saw her in prayer meeting last night, and she has a pair of eyes that can't always look sensible. Now, Davy boy, take heart of grace. Tomorrow will bring another day, and I'll help you with the sums as far as in me lies. Don't waste this lovely hour 'twixt light and dark worrying over arithmetic." "Well, I won't," said Davy, brightening up. "If you help me with the sums, I'll have 'em done in time to go fishing with Milty. I wish old Aunt Atossa's funeral was tomorrow instead of today. I wanted to go to it 'cause Milty said his mother said Aunt Atossa would be sure to rise up in her coffin and say sarcastic things to the folks that come to see her buried. But Marilla said she didn't." "Poor Atossa laid in her coffin peaceful enough," said Mrs. Lynde solemnly. "I never saw her look so pleasant before, that's what. Well, there weren't many tears shed over her, poor old soul. The Elisha Wrights are thankful to be rid of her, and I can't say I blame them a mite." "It seems to me a most dreadful thing to go out of the world and not leave one person behind you who is sorry you are gone," said Anne, shuddering. "Nobody except her parents ever loved poor Atossa, that's certain. Not even her husband," averred Mrs. Lynde. "She was his fourth wife. He'd sort of got into the habit of marrying. He only lived a few years after he married her. The doctor said he died of dyspepsia, but I shall always maintain that he died of Atossa's tongue, that's what. Poor soul, she always knew everything about her neighbors, but she never was very well acquainted with herself. Well, she's gone anyhow, and I suppose the next excitement will be Diana's wedding." "It seems funny and horrible to think of Diana's being married," sighed Anne, hugging her knees and looking through the gap in the haunted wood to the light that was shining in Diana's room. "I don't see what's horrible about it when she's doing so well," said Mrs. Lynde emphatically. "Fred Wright has a fine farm and he is a model young man." "He certainly isn't the wild, dashing, wicked young man Diana once wanted to marry," smiled Anne. "Fred is extremely good. That's just what he ought to be. Would you want Diana to marry a wicked man? Or marry one yourself?" "Oh, no. I wouldn't want to marry anybody who was wicked. But I think I'd like it if he could be wicked and wouldn't. Now Fred is hopelessly good." "You'll have more sense someday, I hope," said Marilla. Marilla spoke rather bitterly. She was grievously disappointed. She knew Anne had refused Gilbert Blythe. Avonlea gossip buzzed over the fact, which had leaked out nobody knew how. Perhaps Charlie Sloane had guessed and told his guesses for truth. Perhaps Diana had betrayed it to Fred, and Fred had been indiscreet. At all events, it was known. Mrs. Blythe no longer asked Anne, in public or private, if she had heard lately from Gilbert, but passed her by with a frosty bow. Anne, who had always liked Gilbert's merry, young-hearted mother, was grieved in secret over this. Marilla said nothing, but Mrs. Lynde gave Anne many exasperated digs about it, until fresh gossip reached that worthy lady, through the medium of Moody Spurgeon MacPherson's mother, that Anne had another beau at college, who was rich and handsome and good all in one. After that Mrs. Rachel held her tongue, though she still wished in her inmost heart that Anne had accepted Gilbert. Riches were all very well, but even Mrs. Rachel, practical soul though she was, did not consider them the one essential. If Anne liked the handsome unknown better than Gilbert, there was nothing more to be said. But Mrs. Rachel was dreadfully afraid that Anne was going to make the mistake of marrying for money. Marilla knew Anne too well to fear this, but she felt that something in the universal scheme of things had gone sadly awry. "What is to be will be," said Mrs. Rachel gloomily, "and what isn't to be happens sometimes. I can't help believing it's going to happen in Anne's case if Providence doesn't interfere, that's what." Mrs. Rachel sighed. She was afraid Providence wouldn't interfere, and she didn't dare to. Anne had wandered down to the Dryad's Bubble and was curled up among the ferns at the root of the big white birch where she and Gilbert had so often sat in summers gone by. He had gone into the newspaper office again when college closed, and Avonlea seemed very dull without him. He never wrote to her, and Anne missed the letters that never came. To be sure, Roy wrote twice a week. His letters were exquisite compositions which would have read beautifully in a memoir or biography. Anne felt herself more deeply in love with him than ever when she read them, but her heart never gave the queer, quick, painful bound at sight of his letters, which it had given one day when Mrs. Hiram Sloane had handed her out an envelope addressed in Gilbert's black, upright handwriting. Anne had hurried home to the east gable and opened it eagerly, to find a typewritten copy of some college society report, only that and nothing more. Anne flung the harmless screed across her room and sat down to write an especially nice epistle to Roy. Diana was to be married in 5 more days. The gray house at Orchard Slope was in a turmoil of baking and brewing and boiling and stewing, for there was to be a big old-timey wedding. Anne, of course, was to be bridesmaid, as had been arranged when they were 12 years old, and Gilbert was coming home from Kingsport to be best man. Anne was enjoying the excitement of the various preparations, but under it all she carried a little heartache. She was, in a sense, losing her dear old chum. Diana's new home would be 2 miles from Green Gables, and the old, constant companionship could never be theirs again. Anne looked up at Diana's light and thought how it had beaconed to her for many years. but soon it would shine through the summer twilights no more. Two big, painful tears welled up in her gray eyes. Oh, she thought, how horrible it is that people have to grow up and marry and change. Chapter 29. Diana's Wedding. "After all, the only real roses are the pink ones," said Anne, as she tied white ribbon around Diana's bouquet in the westward-looking gable at Orchard Slope. "They are the flowers of love and faith." Diana was standing nervously in the middle of the room, arrayed in her bridal white, her black curls frosted over with the film of her wedding veil. Anne had draped that veil, in accordance with the sentimental compact of years before. "It's all pretty much as I used to imagine it long ago, when I wept over your inevitable marriage and our consequent parting," she laughed. "You are the bride of my dreams, Diana, with the lovely misty veil, and I am your bridesmaid. But alas, I haven't the puffed sleeves, though these short lace ones are even prettier. Neither is my heart wholly breaking, nor do I exactly hate Fred." "We're not really parting, Anne," protested Diana. "I'm not going far away. We'll love each other just as much as ever. We've always kept that oath of friendship we swore long ago, haven't we?" "Yes, we've kept it faithfully. We've had a beautiful friendship, Diana. We've never marred it by one quarrel or coolness or unkind word. And I hope it will always be so. But things can't be quite the same after this. You'll have other interests. I'll just be on the outside. But such is life, as Mrs. Rachel says. Mrs. Rachel has given you one of her beloved knitted quilts of the tobacco stripe pattern, and she says when I'm married she'll give me one too." "The mean thing about your getting married is that I won't be able to be your bridesmaid," lamented Diana. "I'm to be Phil's bridesmaid next June, when she marries Mr. Blake, and then I must stop, for you know the proverb, 3 times a bridesmaid, never a bride," said Anne, peeping through the window over the pink and snow of the blossoming orchard beneath. "Here comes the minister, Diana." "Oh, Anne," gasped Diana, suddenly turning very pale and beginning to tremble. "Oh, Anne, I'm so nervous. I can't go through with it. Anne, I know I'm going to faint." "If you do, I'll drag you down to the rainwater hogshead and drop you in," said Anne unsympathetically. "Cheer up, dearest. Getting married can't be so very terrible when so many people survive the ceremony. See how cool and composed I am, and take courage. Wait till your turn comes, Miss Anne. Oh, Anne, I hear father coming upstairs. Give me my bouquet. Is my veil right? Am I very pale?" "You look just lovely. Di, darling, kiss me goodbye for the last time. Diana Barry will never kiss me again. Diana Wright will, though. There, mother's calling. Come." Following the simple, old-fashioned way in vogue then, Anne went down to the parlor on Gilbert's arm. They met at the top of the stairs, for the first time since they had left Kingsport, for Gilbert had arrived only that day. Gilbert shook hands courteously. He was looking very well, though, as Anne instantly noted, rather thin. He was not pale. There was a flush on his cheek that had burned into it as Anne came along the hall towards him, in her soft white dress with lilies of the valley in the shining masses of her hair. As they entered the crowded parlor together, a little murmur of admiration ran around the room. "What a fine-looking pair they are," whispered the impressible Mrs. Rachel to Marilla. Fred ambled in alone with a very red face, and then Diana swept in on her father's arm. She did not faint, and nothing untoward occurred to interrupt the ceremony. Feasting and merrymaking followed. Then, as the evening waned, Fred and Diana drove away through the moonlight to their new home, and Gilbert walked with Anne to Green Gables. Something of their old comradeship had returned during the informal mirth of the evening. Oh, it was nice to be walking over that well-known road with Gilbert again. The night was so very still that one should have been able to hear the whisper of roses in blossom, the laughter of daisies, the piping of grasses, many sweet sounds all tangled up together. The beauty of moonlight on familiar fields irradiated the world. "Can't we take a ramble up Lover's Lane before you go in?" asked Gilbert as they crossed the bridge over the Lake of Shining Waters, in which the moon lay like a great drowned blossom of gold. Anne assented readily. Lover's Lane was a veritable path in a fairyland that night, a shimmering, mysterious place, full of wizardry in the white-woven enchantment of moonlight. There had been a time when such a walk with Gilbert through Lover's Lane would have been far too dangerous, but Roy and Christine had made it very safe now. Anne found herself thinking a good deal about Christine as she chatted lightly to Gilbert. She had met her several times before leaving Kingsport, and had been charmingly sweet to her. Christine had also been charmingly sweet. Indeed, they were a most cordial pair. But for all that, their acquaintance had not ripened into friendship. Evidently Christine was not a kindred spirit. "Are you going to be in Avonlea all summer?" asked Gilbert. "No, I'm going down east to Valley Road next week. Esther Haythorne wants me to teach for her through July and August. They have a summer term in that school, and Esther isn't feeling well, so I'm going to substitute for her. In one way I don't mind. Do you know, I'm beginning to feel a little bit like a stranger in Avonlea now. It makes me sorry, but it's true. It's quite appalling to see the number of children who have shot up into big boys and girls, really young men and women, these past 2 years. Half of my pupils are grown up. It makes me feel awfully old to see them in the places you and I or our mates used to fill. Anne laughed and sighed. She felt very old and mature and wise, which showed how young she was. She told herself that she longed greatly to go back to those dear merry days when life was seen through a rosy mist of hope and illusion, and possessed an indefinable something that had passed away forever. Where was it now, the glory and the dream? "So wags the world away," quoted Gilbert practically and a trifle absently. Anne wondered if he were thinking of Christine. Oh, Avonlea was going to be so lonely now, with Diana gone. Chapter 30. Mrs. Skinner's Romance. Anne stepped off the train at Valley Road station and looked about to see if anyone had come to meet her. She was to board with a certain Miss Janet Sweet, but she saw no one who answered in the least to her preconception of that lady, as formed from Esther's letter. The only person in sight was an elderly woman, sitting in a wagon with mail bags piled around her. 200 would have been a charitable guess at her weight. Her face was as round and red as a harvest moon, and almost as featureless. She wore a tight black cashmere dress made in the fashion of 10 years ago, a little dusty black straw hat trimmed with bows of yellow ribbon, and faded black lace mitts. "Here, you," she called, waving her whip at Anne. "Are you the new Valley Road schoolma'am?" "Yes." "Well, I thought so. Valley Road is noted for its good-looking schoolma'ams, just as Millersville is noted for its humly ones. Janet Sweet asked me this morning if I could bring you out. I said sartin I can, if she don't mind being scrunched up some. This rig of mine's kinder small for the mail bags, and I'm some heftier than Thomas. Just wait, miss, till I shift these bags a bit, and I'll tuck you in somehow. It's only 2 miles to Janet's. Her next-door neighbor's hired boy's comin' for your trunk tonight. My name is Skinner, Amelia Skinner." Anne was eventually tucked in, exchanging amused smiles with herself during the process. "Jog along, black mare," commanded Mrs. Skinner, gathering up the reins in her pudgy hands. "This is my first trip on the mail route. Thomas wanted to hoe his turnips today, so he asked me to come. So I just sot down and took a standing-up snack and started. I sort of like it. Of course it's rather tedious. Part of the time I sits and thinks, and the rest I just sits. Jog along, black mare. I want to get home early. Thomas is terrible lonesome when I'm away. You see, we haven't been married very long." "Oh," said Anne politely. "Just a month. Thomas courted me for quite a spell, though. It was real romantic." Anne tried to picture Mrs. Skinner on speaking terms with romance and failed. "Oh?" she said again. "Yes. You see, there was another man after me. Jog along, black mare. I'd been a widder so long, folks had given up expecting me to marry again. But when my daughter, she's a schoolma'am like you, went out west to teach, I felt real lonesome, and wasn't nowise sot against the idea. By'm by Thomas began to come up, and so did the other feller, William Obadiah Seaman, his name was. For a long time I couldn't make up my mind which of them to take, and they kept coming, and I kept worrying. You see, W.O. was rich. He had a fine place and carried considerable style. He was by far the best match. Jog along, black mare." "Why didn't you marry him?" asked Anne. "Well, you see, he didn't love me," answered Mrs. Skinner solemnly. Anne opened her eyes widely and looked at Mrs. Skinner, but there was not a glint of humor on that lady's face. Evidently Mrs. Skinner saw nothing amusing in her own case. "He'd been a widder man for 3 years, and his sister kept house for him. Then she got married, and he just wanted someone to look after his house. It was worth looking after, too, mind you that. It's a handsome house. Jog along, black mare." As for Thomas, he was poor, and if his house didn't leak in dry weather it was about all that could be said for it, though it looks kind of picturesque. But you see, I loved Thomas, and I didn't care 1 red cent for W.O., so I argued it out with myself. "Sarah Crowe," say I, my first was a crow, "you can marry your rich man if you like, but you won't be happy. Folks can't get along together in this world without a bit of love. You'd just better tie up to Thomas, for he loves you and you love him, and nothing else ain't gonna do you. Jog along, black mare." So I told Thomas I'd take him. All the time I was getting ready I never dared drive past W.O.'s place for fear the sight of that fine house of his would put me back in the Swithers again. But now I never think of it at all, and I'm just that comfortable and happy with Thomas. Jog along, black mare." "How did William Obadiah take it?" queried Anne. "Oh, he rumpused a bit. But he's going to see a skinny old maid in Millersville now, and I guess she'll take him fast enough. She'll make him a better wife than his first did.
W.O. never wanted to marry her. He just asked her to marry him 'cause his father wanted him to, never dreaming but that she'd say no. But mind you, she said yes. There was a predicament for you. Jog along, Black Mare. She was a great housekeeper, but most awful mean. She wore the same bonnet for 18 years. Then she got a new one, and W.O. met her on the road and didn't know her. Jog along, Black Mare. I feel that I'd a narrower escape. I might have married him and been most awful miserable, like my poor cousin Jane Ann. Jane Ann married a rich man she didn't care anything about, and she hasn't the life of a dog. She come to see me last week and says she, Sarah Skinner, I envy you. I'd rather live in a little hut on the side of the road with a man I was fond of than in my big house with the one I've got. Jane Ann's man ain't such a bad sort, nuther, though he's so contrary that he wears his fur coat when the thermometer's at 90. The only way to get him to do anything is to coax him to do the opposite. But there ain't any love to smooth things down, and it's a poor way of living. Jog along, Black Mare. There's Janet's place in the hollow. Wayside, she calls it. Quite picturesque, ain't it? I guess you'll be glad to get out of this with all them mail bags jamming round you.
Yes, but I've enjoyed my drive with you very much, said Anne sincerely.
Get away now, said Mrs. Skinner, highly flattered. Wait till I tell Thomas that. He always feels dreadful tickled when I get a compliment. Jog along, Black Mare. Well, here we are. I hope you'll get on well in the school, miss. There's a short-cut to it through the marsh back at Janet's. If you take that way, be awful keerful. If you once got stuck in that black mud, you'd be sucked right down and never seen or heard tell of again till the day of judgment, like Adam Palmer's cow. Jog along, Black Mare.
Chapter 31. Anne to Philippa. Anne Shirley to Philippa Gordon. Greeting. Well, beloved, it's high time I was writing you. Here am I, installed once more as a country schoolma'am at Valley Road, boarding at Wayside, the home of Miss Janet Sweet. Janet is a dear soul and very nice-looking. Tall, but not over-tall, stoutish, yet with a certain restraint of outline suggestive of a thrifty soul who is not going to be over-lavish, even in the matter of avoirdupois. She has a knot of soft, crimpy brown hair with a thread of gray in it, a sunny face with rosy cheeks, and big, kind eyes as blue as forget-me-nots. Moreover, she is one of those delightful old-fashioned cooks who don't care a bit if they ruin your digestion, as long as they can give you feasts of fat things. I like her, and she likes me, principally, it seems, because she had a sister named Anne who died young. "I'm real glad to see you," she said briskly, when I landed in her yard. "My, you don't look a mite like I expected. I was sure you'd be dark. My sister Anne was dark. And here you are, red-headed." For a few minutes I thought I wasn't going to like Janet as much as I had expected at first sight. Then I reminded myself that I really must be more sensible than to be prejudiced against anyone simply because she called my hair red. Probably the word auburn was not in Janet's vocabulary at all. Wayside is a dear sort of little spot. The house is small and white, set down in a delightful little hollow that drops away from the road. Between road and house is an orchard and flower garden all mixed up together. The front door walk is bordered with quahog clamshells, cowhawks, Janet calls them. There is Virginia creeper over the porch and moss on the roof. My room is a neat little spot off the parlor, just big enough for the bed and me. Over the head of my bed there is a picture of Robbie Burns standing at Highland Mary's grave, shadowed by an enormous weeping willow tree. Robert's face is so lugubrious that it is no wonder I've had bad dreams. Why, the first night I was here I dreamed I couldn't laugh. The parlor is tiny and neat. Its one window is so shaded by a huge willow that the room has a grotto-like effect of emerald gloom. There are wonderful tidies on the chairs, and gay mats on the floor, and books and cards carefully arranged on a round table, and vases of dried grass on the mantelpiece. Between the vases is a cheerful decoration of preserved coffin plates, pertaining respectively to Janet's father and mother, a brother, her sister Anne, and a hired man who died here once. If I go suddenly insane some of these days, know all men by these presents that those coffin plates have caused it. But it's all delightful, and I said so. Janet loved me for it, just as she detested poor Esther because Esther had said so much shade was unhygienic and had objected to sleeping on a feather bed. Now I glory in feather beds, and the more unhygienic and feathery they are, the more I glory. Janet says it is a comfort to see me eat. She had been so afraid I would be like Miss Haythorne, who wouldn't eat anything but fruit and hot water for breakfast, and tried to make Janet give up frying things. Esther is really a dear girl, but she is rather given to fads. The trouble is that she hasn't enough imagination and has a tendency to indigestion. Janet told me I could have the use of the parlor when any young men called. I don't think there are many to call. I haven't seen a young man in Valley Road yet, except the next-door hired boy, Sam Tolliver, a very tall, lank, tow-haired youth.
He came over one evening recently and sat for an hour on the garden fence near the front porch where Janet and I were doing fancy work. The only remarks he volunteered in all that time were, "Have a peppermint, miss? Do now. Fine thing for catarrh, peppermints." And "Powerful lot of jump grasses round here tonight." Yep. But there is a love affair going on here. It seems to be my fortune to be mixed up more or less actively with elderly love affairs. Mr. and Mrs. Irving always say that I brought about their marriage. Mrs. Stephen Clark of Carmody persists in being most grateful to me for a suggestion which somebody else would probably have made if I hadn't. I do really think, though, that Ludovic Speed would never have got any further along than placid courtship if I had not helped him and Theodora Dix out. In the present affair I am only a passive spectator. I've tried once to help things along and made an awful mess of it, so I shall not meddle again. I'll tell you all about it when we meet. Chapter 32. Tea with Mrs. Douglas. On the first Thursday night of Anne's sojourn in Valley Road, Janet asked her to go to prayer meeting. Janet blossomed out like a rose to attend that prayer meeting. She wore a pale blue, pansy-sprinkled muslin dress with more ruffles than one would ever have supposed economical Janet could be guilty of, and a white leghorn hat with pink roses and 3 ostrich feathers on it. Anne felt quite amazed. Later on she found out Janet's motive in so arraying herself, a motive as old as Eden. Valley Road prayer meetings seemed to be essentially feminine. There were 32 women present, 2 half-grown boys, and 1 solitary man, beside the minister. Anne found herself studying this man. He was not handsome or young or graceful. He had remarkably long legs, so long that he had to keep them coiled up under his chair to dispose of them, and he was stoop-shouldered. His hands were big, his hair wanted barbering, and his mustache was unkempt. But Anne thought she liked his face. It was kind and honest and tender. There was something else in it, too. Just what, Anne found it hard to define. She finally concluded that this man had suffered and been strong, and it had been made manifest in his face. There was a sort of patient, humorous endurance in his expression which indicated that he would go to the stake if need be, but would keep on looking pleasant until he really had to begin squirming. When prayer meeting was over, this man came up to Janet and said, "May I see you home, Janet?" Janet took his arm, as primly and shyly as if she were no more than 16, having her first escort home, Anne told the girls at Patty's Place later on. "Miss Shirley, permit me to introduce Mr. Douglas," she said stiffly. Mr. Douglas nodded and said, "I was looking at you in prayer meeting, miss, and thinking what a nice little girl you were." Such a speech from 99 people out of 100 would have annoyed Anne bitterly, but the way in which Mr. Douglas said it made her feel that she had received a very real and pleasing compliment. She smiled appreciatively at him and dropped obligingly behind on the moonlit road. So Janet had a beau. Anne was delighted. Janet would make a paragon of a wife, cheery, economical, tolerant, and a very queen of cooks. It would be a flagrant waste on nature's part to keep her a permanent old maid. "John Douglas asked me to take you up to see his mother," said Janet the next day. "She's bedrid a lot of the time and never goes out of the house, but she's powerful fond of company and always wants to see my boarders. Can you go up this evening?" Anne assented, but later in the day Mr. Douglas called on his mother's behalf to invite them up to tea on Saturday evening. "Oh, why didn't you put on your pretty pansy dress?" asked Anne when they left home. It was a hot day, and poor Janet, between her excitement and her heavy black cashmere dress, looked as if she were being broiled alive. "Old Mrs. Douglas would think it terrible frivolous and unsuitable, I'm afraid. John likes that dress, though," she added wistfully. The old Douglas homestead was half a mile from Wayside, cresting a windy hill. The house itself was large and comfortable, old enough to be dignified, and girdled with maple groves and orchards. There were big, trim barns behind it, and everything bespoke prosperity. Whatever the patient endurance in Mr. Douglas' face had meant, it hadn't, so Anne reflected, meant debts and duns. John Douglas met them at the door and took them into the sitting-room, where his mother was enthroned in an armchair. Anne had expected old Mrs. Douglas to be tall and thin, because Mr. Douglas was. Instead, she was a tiny scrap of a woman, with soft pink cheeks, mild blue eyes, and a mouth like a baby's. Dressed in a beautiful, fashionably made black silk dress, with a fluffy white shawl over her shoulders, and her snowy hair surmounted by a dainty lace cap, she might have posed as a grandmother doll. "How do you do, Janet, dear?" she said sweetly. "I'm so glad to see you again, dear." She put up her pretty old face to be kissed. "And this is our new teacher. I'm delighted to meet you."
My son has been singing your praises until I'm half jealous, and I'm sure Janet ought to be wholly so." Poor Janet blushed. Anne said something polite and conventional, and then everybody sat down and made talk. It was hard work, even for Anne, for nobody seemed at ease except old Mrs. Douglas, who certainly did not find any difficulty in talking. She made Janet sit by her and stroked her hand occasionally. Janet sat and smiled, looking horribly uncomfortable in her hideous dress, and John Douglas sat without smiling. At the tea-table Mrs. Douglas gracefully asked Janet to pour the tea. Janet turned redder than ever, but did it. Anne wrote a description of that meal to Stella. "We had cold tongue and chicken and strawberry preserves, lemon pie and tarts and chocolate cake and raisin cookies and pound cake and fruit cake, and a few other things, including more pie, caramel pie, I think it was." After I had eaten twice as much as was good for me, Mrs. Douglas sighed and said she feared she had nothing to tempt my appetite. "I'm afraid dear Janet's cooking has spoiled you for any other," she said sweetly. "Of course nobody in Valley Road aspires to rival her. Won't you have another piece of pie, Miss Shirley? You haven't eaten anything." Stella, I had eaten a helping of tongue and one of chicken, 3 biscuits, a generous allowance of preserves, a piece of pie, a tart, and a square of chocolate cake. After tea Mrs. Douglas smiled benevolently and told John to take dear Janet out into the garden and get her some roses. "Miss Shirley will keep me company while you are out, won't you?" she said plaintively. She settled down in her armchair with a sigh. "I am a very frail old woman, Miss Shirley. For over 20 years I've been a great sufferer. For 20 long, weary years I've been dying by inches." "How painful," said Anne, trying to be sympathetic and succeeding only in feeling idiotic. "There have been scores of nights when they thought I could never live to see the dawn," went on Mrs. Douglas solemnly. "Nobody knows what I've gone through. Nobody can know but myself. Well, it can't last very much longer now. My weary pilgrimage will soon be over, Miss Shirley. It is a great comfort to me that John will have such a good wife to look after him when his mother is gone. A great comfort, Miss Shirley." "Janet is a lovely woman," said Anne warmly. "Lovely! A beautiful character," assented Mrs. Douglas. "And a perfect housekeeper, something I never was. My health would not permit it, Miss Shirley. I am indeed thankful that John has made such a wise choice. I hope and believe that he will be happy. He is my only son, Miss Shirley, and his happiness lies very near my heart." "Of course," said Anne stupidly. For the first time in her life she was stupid, yet she could not imagine why. She seemed to have absolutely nothing to say to this sweet, smiling, angelic old lady who was patting her hand so kindly. "Come and see me soon again, dear Janet," said Mrs. Douglas lovingly when they left. "You don't come half often enough. But then I suppose John will be bringing you here to stay all the time one of these days." Anne, happening to glance at John Douglas as his mother spoke, gave a positive start of dismay. He looked as a tortured man might look when his tormentors gave the rack the last turn of possible endurance. She felt sure he must be ill, and hurried poor blushing Janet away. "Isn't old Mrs. Douglas a sweet woman?" asked Janet as they went down the road. Answered Anne absently. She was wondering why John Douglas had looked so. "She's been a terrible sufferer," said Janet feelingly. "She takes terrible spells. It keeps John all worried up. He's scared to leave home for fear his mother will take a spell and nobody there but the hired girl." Chapter 33. He just kept coming and coming. 3 days later Anne came home from school and found Janet crying. Tears and Janet seemed so incongruous that Anne was honestly alarmed. "Oh, what is the matter?" she cried anxiously. I'm 40 today," sobbed Janet. "Well, you were nearly that yesterday and it didn't hurt," comforted Anne, trying not to smile. But, went on Janet with a big gulp, "John Douglas won't ask me to marry him." "Oh, but he will," said Anne lamely. "You must give him time, Janet." "Time!" said Janet with indescribable scorn. "He has had 20 years. How much time does he want?" "Do you mean that John Douglas has been coming to see you for 20 years?" "He has. And he has never so much as mentioned marriage to me. And I don't believe he ever will now. I've never said a word to a mortal about it, but it seems to me I've just got to talk it out with someone at last or go crazy. John Douglas begun to go with me 20 years ago before Mother died. Well, he kept coming and coming, and after a spell I begun making quilts and things. But he never said anything about getting married, only just kept coming and coming. There wasn't anything I could do. Mother died when we'd been going together for 8 years.
I thought maybe he would speak out then, seeing as I was left alone in the world. He was real kind and feeling, and did everything he could for me, but he never said marry. And that's the way it has been going on ever since. People blame me for it. They say I won't marry him because his mother is so sickly and I don't want the bother of waiting on her. Why, I'd love to wait on John's mother, but I let them think so. I'd rather they blame me than pity me. It's so dreadful humiliating that John won't ask me. And why won't he? Seems to me if I only knew his reason I wouldn't mind it so much.
Perhaps his mother doesn't want him to marry anybody, suggested Anne.
Oh, she does. She told me time and again that she'd love to see John settled before her time comes. She's always giving him hints. You heard her yourself the other day. I thought I'd 'a' gone through the floor.
It's beyond me, said Anne helplessly. She thought of Ludovic's speed, but the cases were not parallel. John Douglas was not a man of Ludovic's type. You should show more spirit, Janet, she went on resolutely. Why didn't you send him about his business long ago?
I couldn't, said poor Janet pathetically. You see, Anne, I've always been awful fond of John. He might just as well keep coming as not, for there was never anybody else I'd want, so it didn't matter.
But it might have made him speak out like a man, urged Anne.
Janet shook her head. No, I guess not. I was afraid to try anyway, for fear he'd think I meant it and just go. I suppose I'm a poor-spirited creature, but that is how I feel, and I can't help it.
Oh, you could help it, Janet. It isn't too late yet. Take a firm stand. Let that man know you are not going to endure his shilly-shallying any longer. I'll back you up.
I don't know, said Janet hopelessly. I don't know if I could ever get up enough spunk. Things have drifted so long. But I'll think it over.
Anne felt that she was disappointed in John Douglas. She had liked him so well, and she had not thought him the sort of man who would play fast and loose with a woman's feelings for 20 years. He certainly should be taught a lesson, and Anne felt vindictively that she would enjoy seeing the process. Therefore she was delighted when Janet told her, as they were going to prayer meeting the next night, that she meant to show some spirit. "I'll let John Douglas see I'm not going to be trodden on any longer." "You are perfectly right," said Anne emphatically. When prayer meeting was over, John Douglas came up with his usual request. Janet looked frightened but resolute. "No, thank you," she said icily. "I know the road home pretty well alone. I ought to, seeing I've been traveling it for 40 years, so you needn't trouble yourself, Mr. Douglas." Anne was looking at John Douglas, and in that brilliant moonlight she saw the last twist of the rack again. Without a word he turned and strode down the road. "Stop! Stop!" Anne called wildly after him, not caring in the least for the other dumbfounded onlookers. "Mr. Douglas, stop! Come back!" John Douglas stopped, but he did not come back. Anne flew down the road, caught his arm, and fairly dragged him back to Janet. "You must come back," she said imploringly. "It's all a mistake, Mr. Douglas, all my fault. I made Janet do it. She didn't want to, but it's all right now, isn't it, Janet?" Without a word, Janet took his arm and walked away. Anne followed them meekly home and slipped in by the back door. "Well, you are a nice person to back me up," said Janet sarcastically. "I couldn't help it, Janet," said Anne repentantly. "I just felt as if I had stood by and seen murder done. I had to run after him." "Oh, I'm just as glad you did. When I saw John Douglas making off down that road, I just felt as if every little bit of joy and happiness that was left in my life was going with him. It was an awful feeling." "Did he ask you why you did it?" asked Anne. "No, he never said a word about it," replied Janet dully.